discriminatorial land laws. The Moros did not only dislike the coming of Christianized natives from Luzon and Visayas, but resented as well the passing several discriminatory land laws. These laws includes Act Number 496 of 1902, Act 718 of 1903, Act Number 926 of 1903, and the Mining Law and the Cadastral Law of 1907, but also the Act of 2874 of 1919. Now, let's talk about the Act Number 496 of 1902, otherwise known as the Land Registration Act. This act required the registration of land occupied by private persons or corporations. So, kani need i-register ang mga land nga owned by a private person or private sectors. So, need sad na ang agreement is written. So, it is also required that the application for registration of title shall be in written and signed, sworn to by the applicant. So, need daw ang agreement is written din na ay signature sa applicant. So, note that this law was implemented in 1902 while the first school in Moro and Lumad areas were established in later dates. In Cotabato, the first school was established in 1903 inside military camps for Moros who wanted to serve the American Army. So, Salanao had also schools for Moro soldiers only in 1904. Other areas of Minsupala would follow at a much later date. Act Number 718 of 1903. This law declared null and void all land grants made by Moro Datus, Sultan, and chiefs of non-Christian tribes when made without agreement, authority, or consent. Sa kanina law, tanan daw mga grants na gibuhat sa Moro Datus and Sultan nga gihimong null and void nga dili walay authority or pahintulot sa government. Next is the Act 926 of 1903. So this act declared as public lands all lands not registered under Act Number 496 of 1902. Under this law, public lands were to be disposed in three ways: by homestead, purchase, and lease. So sa tanan na lands na walay tag-iya, gideclared ani na act na sa ilalim ng batas na ito, ang pampublikong lupa ay dapat ipamahagi sa tatlong paraan. First, sa pag-homestead or pagbili or kanang pagpaupa. Next, the Mining Law of 1905. This law declared all public lands in the Philippines as free, open to explorations, occupations, and purchase by citizens of the Philippines, and ina-act nagpapahayag na ang lahat ng pampublikong lupa sa Pilipinas ay malaya at bukas para sa lahat. In a way na kanang mag-explore, puy-an, or paliton sa citizens sa Philippines or also kanang mga citizens sa United States. Okay, next is the Cadastral Act of 1907. This law was designed to facilitate the acquisition of new landholdings. This law is deemed to have allowed the educated natives to legalize claims through fraudulent surveys. So, this law was deemed to have allowed the educated natives like Indios and non-Indios, bureaucrats, and American land speculators to have more familiar with the bureaucratic process to legalize claims through fraudulent surveys. Next is the Act 2874 of 1919. This law allowed Christian settlers to homestead by 24 hectares and non-Christian for only 10 hectares. The corporation is allowed for 1,024 hectares. So kani nga law nagahatag sa mga settlers, Christian settlers og tagaan sila og 24 hectares na pwede ma-purchase. And also sa non-Christian is only 10 hectares. And sa mga non ay sa mga corporation allowed sila na mag-purchase og 1,024 hectares. As a consequence of these laws, many of Moros and Lumads would be marginalized and alienated. The Land Registration Act of 1902 and the Public Land Act of 1903, in particular, were responsible for turning many of the natives into squatters of their own lands, aside from the fact that many of them were ignorant of the process of land registering and titling. The government did not exert enough effort to assess the Moros and Lumads in acquiring titles to the lands they were occupying, making Mindanao as part of U.S. territory. So, American colonial policy in the Philippines regarding Mindanao was inconsistent. While Mindanao was officially part of the Philippines, American officials and capitalists sought to make it separate U.S. territory. Starting in 1906, the intensifying in the 1920s, this was driven by the belief that Americans were better suited to govern the Moro people than Filipinos, and that Mindanao's resources, such as oil station, naval base, and rubber, were strategically valuable to the U.S. Several high-ranking U.S. officials supported these views. Bills were introduced in Congress to annex Mindanao, but these efforts were ultimately defeated by Filipino nationalist opposition and broader U.S. policy favoring Philippines independence. They attempt to separate Mindanao. However, contribution to the division between Christians and Moro Filipinos fostered a separatist movement. So, American colonial policy also suffered from inconsistency, or executed differently in actual practice. While it made Mindanao part of the Philippine Islands under the Treaty of Paris, certain practice also showed that Americans wanted it themselves. The administration of the Moro province unwittingly gave many American officials and capitalists a reason to make it a permanent territory of the United States. It began in the 1906 and intensified through the 1920s, when American planters, with the backing of American officials, petitioned Washington to incorporate Mindanao into the U.S. territory. So, in fact, Colonel Ralph Hoyt, then acting governor of the Moro province, echoed the same stand in his 1909 annual report. He recommended that Mindanao was segregated from the rest of the Philippines and declared as territory of the U.S., not as a colony but as coaling station and naval base with a civil military government similar to the present government of the Moro province. Several missions or visits of the Philippines by high U.S. officials tended to support this view on the ground that Americans are in a better position than Filipinos to govern the Moros. Filipinos are unfit to self-government, and Moros are united for the continuation of American rule. Among other reasons, in fact, some Moros petitioned during this period highlight the plan to incorporate Mindanao into the U.S. rather than into Philippines. So two of these many effects are worth nothing. They put a barrier against the move of Philippine independence and demonstrated that the Filipinos were not yet politically mature to handle their own affairs, even after a period of Philippinization. Thus, the Filipino governing the Moros is undeniable preposition. Between 1920 and 1927, the political climate of the Philippines under Governor General Leonard Woods seemed to have favored a continuing hold on the Philippines Peace value statement. The Americans, unlike the Spaniards, successfully incorporated these Moro territories into the Philippine colony through a divine rule strategy. This involved cultivating relationship with some Moros and Lumad groups to counter others, ultimately relegating and one sovereign sultanates to the status of subservient government. The discriminatory nature of American policies, particularly the public land laws, which favored Christian Filipinos to lead the systematic displacement of Moros and Lumans. It points out the irony of the American official expressing unification while stimulously pursuing policies that benefited their own interests and catered to Christian Filipino at the response of the Moro and Lumads population. The unsuccessful attempt to make the Southern Islands a permanent U.S. territory mirrors the annexation of Hawaii, illustrating a pattern of self-serving motivates. The inclusion emphasized the need to learn more this history and avoiding repeating discriminatory policies. The American policies, especially the public land laws, should enlighten us to that it was not the ordinary Christian native who began the idea of taking the ancestral lands of Moros and Lumads. In fact, the American colonizer even had a hard time convincing the first Christian volunteers to migrate to Mindanao. It thus appears American colonial policies were responsible for starting the systematic, massive, and institutional marginalization of the Moros and Lumads, which unfortunately continued and even intensified during succeeding Philippine governments. That concludes my report. Thank you for listening.